Well, we know one criminal in Tennessee who did not escape death row is Christa Pike, the only woman set to be put to death right now in our state for a brutal murder she was convicted of carrying out when she was just 18.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, take Mr. Pike into the house.
Can I please have my mom before I go?
Mr. Bates, please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
Please, let me just find my mom.
Please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
I love you. I love you too. I love you too.
Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in Tennessee history. A case centered on Christa Pike, a name that has remained etched into the public consciousness for decades. She was just 18 years old when she was convicted of a brutal and calculated murder, a crime that would place her on death row and make her the only woman currently facing execution in the state. A sentence delivered in cold legal language, ordering that she be put to death by electrocution, transferred into the custody of the Tennessee prison system, and prepared for an end few can truly comprehend that I in the courtroom. Final words echoed through the chamber. Emotions spilled over. I love you was spoken again and again, cutting through the formality of the proceedings. It was a moment that captured the collision between law, humanity, and irreversible consequence. Now, decades later, that moment is once again approaching reality. On September 30th, 2026, Christa Pike is scheduled to become the first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years. This looming date follows years of appeals, legal motions, and intense public debate. Some see accountability finally carried out. Others see a system grappling with how to judge crimes committed at the edge of adulthood. But the question that continues to haunt this case is simple and unsettling. How did an 18-year-old end up here? What began as a volatile mix of jealousy, anger, and emotional instability would spiral into a crime that shocked an entire community. A single night set into motion consequences that could never be undone. Was it a toxic relationship that fueled the violence? Was it untreated mental health struggles? Or was there something darker beneath the surface that pushed her past a point of return? As we examine the events leading up to the murder, the aftermath, and the legal battles that followed, this case forces a conversation about youth, about punishment, and about whether justice can ever account for the complexity of the human mind. Stay with us as we unravel a story that challenges how society defines guilt. Mercy. On January 12, 1995, 3 students signed out of the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. Christa Pike, her boyfriend Tatterell Shipp, and their acquaintance Shadala Peterson. It was a routine process. Names written down, time recorded, students leaving campus for the evening. Nothing about the moment suggested it would later be examined line by investigators, attorneys, and jurors. Job Corps was intended to be a second chance, a federally funded program designed to help young people from unstable backgrounds gain education, structure, and job skills. Many students arrived carrying heavy emotional baggage, broken homes, abuse, addiction. For some, it was the first stable environment they had ever known. 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer was one of those students. She had enrolled with the hope of rebuilding her life. Friends described her as optimistic and focused on moving forward. She talked about plans beyond Job Corps, about independence, about starting over. Christa Pike was also enrolled at the center, but her emotional state was far more fragile. She had developed an intense attachment to Tatterell Shipp. Their relationship quickly became volatile. Arguments were frequent. Jealousy was constant. Pike became increasingly suspicious of anyone she believed might threaten the relationship. Over time, her attention fixated on Colleen. Pike became convinced that Colleen was getting too close to Shipp, that conversations meant more than they appeared, that her relationship was being undermined. There was no evidence of an affair, but perception mattered more than reality. Friends later recalled Pike growing more agitated, more possessive, more consumed by the idea of betrayal. What began as insecurity hardened into resentment, and resentment slowly transformed into something darker. On the night of January 12th, Pike suggested confronting Colleen. She proposed meeting away from campus, a secluded area students sometimes visited to avoid supervision. Colleen agreed to go. There was no indication she believed she was walking into danger. What happened next unfolded beyond the view of witnesses. Investigators later relied on confessions, physical evidence, and testimony to reconstruct the events. The meeting began as a conversation. Accusations were made. Emotions escalated. Voices were raised. At some point, the confrontation turned physical. The shift was sudden. Violence replaced words. Colleen was attacked with extreme force. The assault was prolonged and brutal. By the time it ended, she was dead. Afterward, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson returned to Job Corps. Their names were logged back in. But one name was missing. Colleen Slemmer never returned. The following morning, disturbing reports began to surface. Pike was seen acting strangely. She spoke openly about the night before. She bragged. She showed other students a fragment of bone, claiming it belonged to Colleen. First, some thought she was lying. Then fear set in. Staff members were alerted. Authorities were contacted. Investigators reviewed the sign-out logs. The timeline immediately raised concern. 3 students had left together. Only 2 had returned. Police began questioning students. Multiple witnesses described Pike's statements. Her behavior was erratic and unsettling. The investigation escalated quickly. Forensic evidence soon provided confirmation. A fragment of Colleen Slemmer's skull was discovered inside Pike's jacket. The discovery directly tied her to the crime. Combined with witness accounts, the evidence became overwhelming. Within 36 hours of the murder, Christa Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadala Peterson were arrested. During questioning, Pike confessed to the killing. She claimed the situation had spiraled out of control, that it was never meant to end in death. Investigators disagreed. The nature of the injuries suggested sustained intent. The planning suggested forethought. What had begun as jealousy had ended in irreversible violence. The case moved forward rapidly. What happened that night would soon be dissected in court. But to understand how it happened, authorities needed to look far earlier than January 12, 1995. Christa Pike was born on March 10, 1976 in Beckley, West Virginia. From an early age, her life was marked by instability. Her parents' relationship was volatile, defined by constant arguments, separation, and reconciliation. The household lacked consistency and emotional safety. The one steady presence in Pike's childhood was her grandmother. She provided comfort and protection. When her grandmother died, Pike lost the only source of stability she had known. The loss left a lasting impact. As Pike grew older, neglect and abuse became more pronounced. She experienced both emotional and physical harm. She withdrew socially. Anger and depression took hold. By the age of 12, she attempted suicide. It was an early sign of severe psychological distress. Throughout her teenage years, self-harm continued. Substance abuse followed. Alcohol and drugs became coping mechanisms. Her behavior grew increasingly difficult to manage. Eventually, she was placed in juvenile facilities. While institutionalized, Pike received limited treatment. The deeper trauma remained unaddressed. When she turned 18, Job Corps appeared to offer a fresh start, a chance to escape her past and rebuild. Instead, unresolved trauma followed her. Her relationship with Tatterall Shipp quickly became emotionally consuming. Fear of abandonment intensified. Any perceived threat triggered extreme reactions. After her arrest, prosecutors built their case methodically. The evidence was extensive. Pike's confession, the skull fragment found in her jacket, witness testimony from students who heard her discuss the crime. The narrative was clear. The trial began in early 1996. Pike's defense team focused on mitigation rather than denial. They presented her history of abuse, her mental health struggles, Psychological experts testified about emotional instability and impaired judgment. The prosecution emphasized the brutality of the murder, the prolonged attack, the behavior afterward, the lack of remorse displayed in her comments to peers. They argued the crime was intentional and especially cruel. The jury deliberated. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. Attention then turned to sentencing. Pike's attorneys pleaded for leniency. They emphasized her age. She was 18 years old at the time of the crime, barely an adult. They argued her mental illness reduced culpability. The jury rejected those arguments. They concluded the crime was aggravated, deliberate, and deserving of the harshest penalty. In March 1996, Christa Pike was sentenced to death by electrocution. She became the first woman in Tennessee to receive a death sentence in more than 200 years. The ruling sparked immediate controversy. Questions emerged about executing someone so young, about mental illness, about justice versus mercy. Appeals followed. Each focused on Pike's psychological condition and traumatic upbringing. Each was denied. The conviction and sentence remained intact. Pike was transferred to death row at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. She became the only woman housed there. Her confinement was isolating. Her mental health deteriorated further. Evaluations documented depression, instability, and emotional distress. Still, the courts upheld the sentence. As years passed, Pike's case became a focal point in debates over capital punishment, especially concerning young offenders with mental illness. The legal system had spoken, but public opinion remained divided. Life on death row was defined by isolation. Christa Pike spent years confined largely alone. The weight of her sentence followed her daily. Appeals continued, each arguing that her mental illness and developmental immaturity should exempt her from execution. In 2012, authorities uncovered an escape plot involving Pike and an outside individual. Although she was not formally charged, the discovery raised serious concerns about her mental state and behavior. The incident added another layer of complexity to an already controversial case. Despite continued legal efforts, the courts remained unmoved. Tennessee upheld the conviction and sentence. Pike remained on death row. Meanwhile, Colleen Slemmer's family continued to advocate for justice. Her mother, May Slemmer Martinez, became a vocal supporter of the death penalty in this case. For her, the brutality of the crime outweighed any mitigating factors. She argued that accountability demanded the highest punishment. As the years passed, Pike's case became symbolic. Supporters argued that executing someone who committed a crime at 18, while suffering from severe mental illness, was unethical. Opponents argued that the crime itself justified the sentence regardless of age or diagnosis. In 2025, the state set an execution date, September 30th, 2026. The announcement reignited national attention. Media coverage intensified. Advocacy groups mobilized. Mental health experts weighed in. Legal scholars debated precedent. The question resurfaced. How should the justice system treat young offenders with complex psychological histories? Pike's attorneys filed last appeals. They cited evolving standards of decency, advances in neuroscience, the understanding that adolescent brains continue developing into the mid-20s. The courts again declined to intervene as the execution date approaches. Christa Pike remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. If carried out, her execution would mark the first of a woman in the state in more than 2 centuries. The case continues to force uncomfortable questions about punishment, about responsibility, about whether justice can ever fully account for trauma, youth, and mental illness. For some, the answer is clear. A life was taken brutally. The sentence must stand. For others, the case represents a failure to balance accountability with compassion. What remains undisputed is the impact. One night in 1995 altered countless lives. Colleen Slemmer lost her future. Families were shattered. And a legal system was left grappling with the limits of justice as the final date draws closer. The debate surrounding Christa Pike's fate continues, not just in Tennessee, but across the country. A reminder that some cases never truly end. They linger, forcing society to confront its own values. The story of Christa Pike remains one of the most unsettling and debated cases in the history of American capital punishment. It sits at the intersection of youth, violence, and the ultimate penalty, forcing difficult questions that have never found easy answers. Pike was just 18 years old when the crime was committed, legally an adult, yet still at an age many consider emotionally and psychologically unfinished. That fact alone continues to challenge how society defines responsibility and punishment. Central to this debate is Pike's documented history of mental illness. Diagnoses such as bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder have been repeatedly cited by her defense as critical factors that shaped her behavior and impaired her judgment. Supporters of reconsideration argue that these conditions, combined with a childhood marked by abuse and instability, should carry significant weight when determining whether execution is appropriate. They question whether the justice system adequately accounts for mental health when imposing irreversible sentences. At the same time, the brutality of the crime cannot be ignored. The evidence presented at trial, Pike's own confession, and the calculated nature of the violence led a jury to conclude that the most severe punishment was justified. For many, accountability must remain absolute, regardless of age or diagnosis. They argue that premeditation and cruelty demand consequences equal to the harm inflicted. As September 30, 2026 approaches, public opinion remains deeply divided. Some see this case as a necessary affirmation of justice. Others view it as a troubling example of how the system handles young and mentally ill offenders. Beyond one individual, this case raises broader questions about ethics, punishment, and the future of the death penalty itself. So where do you stand? Should Christa Pike be executed, or should her sentence be reconsidered in light of her age and mental health history? Share your thoughts in the comments.